The Duke walked past Camille like she didn't exist. The family beauty who'd been groomed her entire life to secure exactly this match, and asked Eleanor, the overlooked sister in purple, about parliamentary failure instead of her embroidery skills. Lady Bradley's face went white because she'd bet everything on the wrong daughter, and now the most powerful man in England was requesting private meetings with the girl they'd dismissed as unmarriageable. But when a rival socialite whispered that Eleanor was just a convenient shield, a meek wife to hide the Duke's political scandals, Eleanor had to ask the one question that could destroy everything. Was she chosen for love, or because she knew how to stay silent? If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The late afternoon light streamed weakly through the oriel window of the Bradleys' country residence, catching the gold thread in the tapestry as Eleanor Bradley's fingers smoothed the creases from a simple muslin bandage. She was sorting supplies for her local parish outreach, finding a quiet, genuine purpose in the task that formal society never offered her. "Miss Elena," the urgent whisper of Mrs. Evans, the maid, broke through the stillness. "Your mother requires your presence in the withdrawing room, immediately. The entire house is in a flurry." Eleanor, woman in purple, reluctantly set aside her work, the quiet grace of her manner a stark contrast to the urgency of the summons. "What grave matter demands my attention this time, Mrs. Evans? Has the delivery of Camille's French silks been delayed?" "Much more consequential than silks, Miss Elena," Mrs. Evans replied, her eyes wide with dramatic importance. "Word has arrived from London. The Duke of Danbury is back for the season, and your mother is determined that he should meet Miss Camille." Eleanor rose, smoothing the rich, simple lines of her deep purple gown, a colour chosen not to dazzle, but for its quiet elegance. Another duke for Camille to enthrall. Ah, the famously reserved Duke Nathaniel Crowhurst, man in blue. I see. Mother has identified her final, most powerful target this season. Mrs. Evans offered a sympathetic look. "Lady Bradley only wants what is best for the family, Miss Elena." Of course she does, Eleanor thought. A familiar ache of weariness in her chest. At 21, she was already eclipsed. At 23, Camille, woman in green, was the family jewel, whose beauty was meant to redeem their dwindling finances. The withdrawing room was a scene of controlled chaos. Lady Bradley was consulting with the dressmaker as Camille, radiant in a gown the colour of fresh emeralds, woman in green, spun before a triple mirror. "There you are, Elena," Lady Bradley exclaimed, barely sparing her a glance. "For heaven's sake, why must you always wear that subdued purple? Never mind. We have secured an invitation to the Duchess of Somerset's ball, and Duke Nathaniel will be in attendance." "I shall wear the diamonds and the French lace," Camille trilled excitedly. "No man can resist me in that ensemble. The Duke will be utterly captivated." "Not every gentleman, my dear," Lady Bradley corrected, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Only one matters. The Duke is known to despise frivolous ornamentation, but we must present a united front, Elena. You will attend, dressed appropriately. Your presence is needed to demonstrate our family's respectability." Eleanor opened her mouth, ready to protest her role as the insignificant chaperone, but the look in her mother's eye silenced her. She resigned herself, knowing that her sole purpose at the ball would be to ensure Camille shone brighter, and that she herself remained perfectly, safely unseen. The Duchess of Somerset's ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, their light catching on crystal chandeliers and the jewels adorning London's most distinguished guests. Eleanor stood near a marble column draped in ivy, her deep purple gown allowing her to blend into the shadows, while Camille, resplendent in emerald silk that seemed to capture every flicker of light, held court at the center of the room. The murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd before Elena saw him. Duke Nathaniel Crowhurst, tall and composed in his perfectly tailored blue evening coat, moving through the assembly with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to demand attention. His dark hair was immaculately dressed, his expression remote and evaluating, as though he were examining a ledger rather than attending a ball. Lady Bradley materialized at Camille's side with practiced precision, her smile brilliant and determined. Elena watched from her safe distance as her mother executed the introduction with flawless grace, presenting Camille like a masterwork to be admired. Camille's curtsy was perfect, a delicate dip that showed her elegant neck and the diamond necklace that sparkled against her throat. "Your Grace, what an honor. I have heard so much about your work in Parliament. It must be terribly demanding." The Duke's bow was correct, his expression polite. "Miss Havisham, you are very kind." "I confess," Camille continued, deploying the slight breathlessness that had devastated 3 viscounts and an earl. "I find politics quite beyond my comprehension. I much prefer to leave such weighty matters to gentlemen of superior intellect, such as yourself." Eleanor winced inwardly. It was the wrong approach. She could see it in the subtle cooling of the Duke's grey eyes, the almost imperceptible stiffening of his posture. "How fortunate for you," he replied, his tone perfectly pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth. "The Duchess of Somerset has assembled quite a remarkable collection of orchids in her conservatory. Perhaps you might find them more to your taste." It was a dismissal, elegantly executed. Camille's smile never wavered, but Eleanor saw the brief flash of confusion in her sister's eyes before Lady Bradley smoothly redirected the conversation, introducing a Lord Pemberton who had been hovering nearby. The Duke extracted himself with practiced ease, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman. His gaze swept the room with that same calculating assessment, and Elena instinctively pressed closer to her column, wishing she could disappear into the ivy entirely. But his eyes found her anyway. For a moment, their gazes locked across the crowded ballroom, and Elena felt a jolt of something she couldn't name, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Then the Duke was moving, not toward the cluster of ambitious mammas and their daughters, but directly toward her quiet corner. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as he approached. She had no practiced smiles, no rehearsed flirtations. She had only the truth, and the truth had never been enough before. "Miss Bradley, I believe." His voice was deep and measured, with an edge of genuine curiosity that startled her. She curtsied, hoping he couldn't hear the nervous flutter in her breathing. "Your Grace, yes, I am Elena Bradley. I confess I engineered this introduction deliberately," he said, positioning himself beside her so they both faced the ballroom rather than each other, a subtle courtesy that eased the intensity of the moment. "I was hoping to find someone who might offer an informed opinion rather than flattery." Eleanor blinked. "I am not certain I follow, Your Grace." "The Factory Education Bill," he said calmly, as though discussing legislation at a ball were the most natural thing in the world. "It failed its second reading last week. The Times called it a well-intentioned disaster. I'm curious whether you agree with that assessment." The question caught her so completely off guard that she answered honestly, without thought to how she should respond. "I think the Times failed to consider the practical implementation. The bill's structure was sound, requiring mill owners to provide 4 hours of schooling daily for child workers. But it offered no mechanism for enforcement and no funding for qualified teachers. Good intentions without practical support are merely performance, Your Grace." She stopped abruptly, horrified at her own boldness. Ladies did not lecture dukes about parliamentary failures, but when she dared glance at his face, she found him watching her with keen attention, his grey eyes suddenly alive with interest. "You've read the bill itself, then, not merely the commentary?" Yes, Your Grace. My parish work brings me into contact with families whose children work in the textile mills. I wanted to understand what the proposed legislation would actually mean for them." "And your conclusion?" Elena took a breath, deciding that if she had already ruined any chance of polite tolerance, she might as well speak the full truth. "That the lords who drafted it have never spoken to a mill worker or visited a factory floor. They know what should be done, but not how it could be done. There's a difference." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a warmth breaking through the reserved mask. "There is indeed, Miss Bradley, a distinction far too few people grasp." He was silent for a moment, and Elena became acutely aware of the curious glances being cast their way. The Duke, who had dismissed Camille in under 3 minutes, had been speaking with the invisible sister for far longer. "I am working on a revised proposal," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "One that addresses precisely the practical failures you've identified. I would very much value the perspective of someone who understands the reality rather than the theory." Eleanor's throat went dry. "Your Grace, I'm not certain." "Would you permit me to call upon you, Miss Bradley, to discuss the matter further?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Lady Bradley appeared at her elbow, her expression a masterwork of confusion and desperate hope. "Your Grace, what a delightful surprise to find you conversing with my Eleanor." The Duke turned to her mother with perfect courtesy. "Lady Bradley, I was just requesting your permission to call upon Miss Bradley at your earliest convenience. I find her insights on educational reform quite invaluable." Eleanor watched her mother's face cycle through shock, calculation, and forced delight in the span of 3 seconds. Of course, Your Grace, we would be most honored. Perhaps tomorrow afternoon?" "Tomorrow afternoon would be ideal." The Duke bowed to Lady Bradley, then turned to Eleanor, and for just a moment his reserved expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "Until tomorrow, Miss Bradley. I look forward to our discussion." He was gone before Eleanor could manage more than a breathless curtsy, leaving her standing beside her stunned mother as the ballroom erupted in whispers. Across the room, Camille stared at her sister with an expression Eleanor had never seen before, pure, undiluted shock. The following afternoon arrived with agonizing slowness. Lady Bradley had transformed the main drawing room into a stage set worthy of Drury Lane, fresh flowers arranged with mathematical precision, the best silver service gleaming on the side table, and Camille positioned near the window where the light would catch her golden hair like a halo. Eleanor had been dressed in a gown of softer lavender, a compromise her mother had insisted upon. "That purple makes you look like a governess," Lady Bradley had hissed, while the maid laced her stays. "At least try to appear approachable." Now Eleanor sat in the corner chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching her mother pace, and Camille adjust her emerald day dress for the 7th time. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 3 o'clock with the inexorable patience of an executioner. When the knock finally came, Lady Bradley practically leapt to arrange herself in a posture of elegant surprise, as though she hadn't been listening for hoofbeats on the gravel drive for the past hour. The butler announced him with appropriate gravity. "His Grace, the Duke of Danbury." Nathaniel Crowhurst entered, and Elena was struck again by the controlled power in his bearing, the way he moved through space as though he had calculated the exact energy required for each step and refused to waste a single degree of effort. His blue morning coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. "Your Grace." Lady Bradley swept into a curtsy. "What an honour you do our humble household. Please do sit. Camille, my dear, come greet his Grace properly." Camille rose with practised grace, her smile radiant. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you again." The Duke bowed, his courtesy impeccable, and his eyes already moving past her. "Miss Havisham, Lady Bradley, thank you for receiving me." His gaze found Elena in her corner, and something in his expression shifted, warmed. "Miss Bradley." Elena felt her cheeks flush as she rose to curtsy. "Your Grace." "I trust you've had time to consider our discussion from last evening," he said, addressing her directly, while her mother and sister remained frozen in confusion. Yes, Your Grace. I have given it considerable thought." "Excellent." He turned to Lady Bradley with polite finality. "Lady Bradley, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality to speak with Miss Bradley privately regarding the educational initiative we discussed. I assure you, my intentions are entirely honourable, and perhaps a maid might be stationed nearby to preserve propriety." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Bradley's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Camille had gone very still, her practised smile frozen on her face like a porcelain doll's. That is, of course, Your Grace," Lady Bradley finally managed. "The small drawing-room, perhaps. Eleanor, do try to be helpful." The small drawing-room was at the back of the house, decorated in shades of cream and pale blue, with tall windows overlooking the garden. Mrs. Evans was stationed discreetly in the hallway, the door left appropriately ajar. Elena stood near the window, her hands clasped together to stop their trembling, as the Duke crossed to stand a respectful distance away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Your Grace," Elena began, deciding that honesty had served her well enough last night, "I feel I must be frank with you." His eyebrow lifted slightly. "Please do. I find frankness distressingly rare in London drawing-rooms." "My family is not wealthy," she said quietly, the words harder to speak than she'd anticipated. "Our finances are precarious. My mother brought Camille to London with a very specific purpose, to secure an advantageous marriage, preferably to a duke." She met his eyes, refusing to look away despite the heat in her cheeks. "I tell you this, so you understand that any attention you show me will be interpreted through that lens. My mother will see strategy, my sister will see betrayal, and I—" "And you?" he prompted gently. "I cannot afford to misunderstand your intentions, Your Grace. I have no dowry, no connections, no beauty that would justify a duke's interest. If this is merely intellectual curiosity or a passing amusement, I would prefer to know now before I—" She stopped, appalled at what she had almost admitted. "Before you what, Miss Bradley?" She shook her head, unable to answer. The Duke was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse race. Then he moved closer, still maintaining propriety, but near enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver thread in his blue waistcoat. "May I tell you a truth of my own?" he asked softly. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "I have been pursued by every ambitious mother in London for the past 3 years," he said. "I have been flattered, fawned over, and subjected to every variety of feminine accomplishment from watercolours to harp recitals. I have met women who could recite poetry in 3 languages, but had never had an original thought. I have danced with diamonds and pearls and emeralds." His emphasis on the word made Elena's breath catch. and found every one of them exquisitely hollow. He took a breath, and something vulnerable crossed his features. "I do not need another ornament, Miss Bradley. I need a partner. Someone who sees the work that must be done and understands why it matters. Someone who speaks truth rather than flattery. Someone with—" He paused, searching for words. "Quiet depth." The phrase hung in the air between them, intimate and devastating. "I saw you last night," he continued, "standing in the shadows in that purple gown, watching the entire spectacle with such clear-eyed understanding, and I thought, there is someone real." Eleanor's throat was tight. "Your Grace, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll allow me to call again. Say you'll continue to speak to me as though I'm Nathaniel, not just a duke. Say you'll give me the chance to prove that my interest is neither passing nor strategic, but entirely, dangerously genuine." Before she could answer, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a slim package wrapped in brown paper. "I took the liberty of bringing you something. A gift, though perhaps an presumptuous one." Elena unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was a book, its leather binding worn but cared for. Ruskin's The Stones of Venice, a rare early edition. "You mentioned your parish work," the Duke said quietly. "I thought you might appreciate Ruskin's observations on how architecture shapes community. There's a passage on page 47 I've marked, about the difference between building for beauty and building for purpose." Eleanor opened to the marked page and found a small slip of paper in his handwriting. "True beauty serves. False beauty merely pleases. You are the former. N." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and found him watching her with an expression of such hope that her heart turned over in her chest. "You may call again, Your Grace," she whispered. "Nathaniel." His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds, rare, warm, and entirely transforming. "Tomorrow, then, Elena." The Duke's visits became a regular fixture over the following fortnight, and with each one, the household's bewilderment deepened into something approaching panic. Lady Bradley had abandoned subtlety entirely, positioning Camille in increasingly strategic locations, by the pianoforte, near the French doors, even once directly in the Duke's path as he entered the drawing-room. "Your Grace!" Camille had exclaimed with bright surprise, as though his arrival weren't the sole topic of household conversation for the past 3 hours. "I was just about to play a new piece I've learned, a Scottish air, quite melancholy and moving. Would you care to listen?" Nathaniel had bowed with flawless courtesy. "How accomplished you are, Miss Havisham. Unfortunately, I've come to continue my discussion with Miss Bradley regarding the tenant school initiative. Perhaps another time." It was not a perhaps that held any genuine possibility, and they all knew it. Now Eleanor sat across from him in the small drawing-room that had become their sanctuary. A portfolio of his estate plans spread across the low table between them. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the gold in his hair and turning his blue coat almost luminous. "The problem," Nathaniel was saying, his finger tracing a line on the architectural sketch, "is that the current schoolhouse is too far from the workers' cottages. The children would need to walk nearly 2 miles, which is impractical when they're expected to work partial days in the fields during harvest." Elena leaned forward, studying the map with keen attention. She had chosen today's gown with unusual care, a dress of rich violet silk that Mrs. Evans had unearthed from the back of her wardrobe, one she'd always dismissed as too fine for her quiet life. But this morning, looking at herself in the mirror, she had seen something different. Not a woman trying to compete with her sister's beauty, but one claiming her own distinctive grace. What if you built 2 smaller schools instead of 1 large one? She suggested, pointing to 2 locations on the map. Here, near the northern tenant farms, and here, closer to the mill village. It would cost more initially, but the attendance would be better, and you could hire local women as teachers, mothers who already understand the rhythms of agricultural and millwork. Nathaniel's eyes lit with that particular intensity she'd come to recognize, the look that meant she'd seen something he'd missed. That's brilliant. It solves both the accessibility problem and creates employment. Elena, you have a remarkable mind for practical implementation. The sound of her given name, spoken in his deep voice with such warm approval, sent heat blooming across her cheeks. The drawing-room door opened wider than propriety required, and Lady Bradley swept in with Camille in tow, carrying a tea service as though they were performing a rescue mission. "Your Grace, you've been closeted away for nearly an hour," Lady Bradley announced with forced gaiety. "Surely you require refreshment. Camille has prepared the tea herself, exactly as she learned from the French governess. Such an accomplished girl." Camille moved forward with studied grace, the tea service balanced perfectly in her hands, her emerald afternoon dress a calculated masterpiece. "I do hope you prefer it with sugar, Your Grace. I've been told I have quite a delicate hand with the measurements." "You're very kind," Nathaniel replied, accepting the cup with polite detachment. He took one dutiful sip, set it aside, and immediately returned his attention to Elena. "As I was saying, the budget concerns could be addressed through a phased construction approach. If we begin with the Mill Village School and demonstrate success, the other landowners might be persuaded to contribute to the northern location." Lady Bradley hovered uncertainly, clearly unwilling to leave, but unable to find a natural entry point into a conversation about educational funding structures. Camille arranged herself artfully on the settee, her posture perfect, her expression pleasant and utterly vacant. "Your Grace," Camille ventured sweetly, "all this talk of schools and budgets must be terribly tedious. Surely you'd prefer to discuss the upcoming opera season." "I've heard the soprano from Milan is absolutely divine." The look Nathaniel turned on Camille was not unkind, but it was utterly indifferent. The expression one might give a pleasant but unremarkable piece of furniture. "I find few things less tedious than the education of children who would otherwise have none, Miss Havisham. But thank you for your concern." Elena watched her sister's face carefully maintain its smile, while something wounded flickered in her eyes. For a brief moment, she almost felt sorry for Camille, who had done everything right according to society's rules, and found those rules, suddenly, inexplicably changed. "Eleanor has been advising me on my parish outreach as well," Nathaniel continued, his attention already back on Eleanor, as though the interruption had never occurred. "Tell me about the women's lending library you mentioned. How did you convince the vicar to approve it?" Eleanor felt the familiar spark of passion that always accompanied this topic. "I didn't, initially. He thought books would give the women inappropriate ideas. So I started with practical texts. Household management, basic medicine, simple accounting. Once the women began managing their household budgets more effectively and treating childhood illnesses before they became serious, the vicar decided the library was his idea all along." Nathaniel's laugh was genuine and delighted. "That's not just brilliant. It's strategic. You outmaneuvered him while letting him claim the victory. Sometimes the work matters more than the credit, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he corrected softly, his grey eyes holding hers, "when we discuss things that matter, I would prefer you call me Nathaniel." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like silk, and Elena was acutely aware of her mother's sharp intake of breath, Camille's rigid posture on the settee. Over the following days, Elena found herself choosing her clothing with new intentionality, not to compete with Camille's jewel-bright beauty, but to honor her own emerging sense of self. Deep purples that spoke of dignity rather than display, soft grays paired with violet ribbons, a midnight blue that made her eyes luminous and recalled the colour of Nathaniel's favourite coat. Mrs. Evans noticed the change, her eyes knowing as she arranged Elena's hair in softer, more elegant styles. "You're blooming, Miss Elena," the maid said quietly one morning. "Like a flower that was always beautiful, but needed the right light to show it." When Nathaniel arrived that afternoon and saw Elena descending the stairs in a gown of deep amethyst silk, his expression shifted into something that made her breath catch, admiration mixed with something deeper, something almost reverent. "Elena," he said, forgetting propriety entirely as he took her hand and brought it to his lips, "you look absolutely radiant." Behind them, Camille stood in her signature emerald, surrounded by all her practiced beauty and perfect accomplishments, and for the first time in their lives, she was completely invisible. Lady Bradley's face had gone pale with the dawning realization that all her careful planning had been for nothing, that the Duke had already made his choice, and it was not the choice anyone had expected. Elena met Nathaniel's eyes and saw her own quiet joy reflected there. She had spent 21 years believing she was not enough. But standing here, valued for her mind and her purpose rather than her appearance, she finally understood that she had always been enough. She had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to see. The Marquis of Ashford's garden party was the event of the season, transforming his ancestral estate into something between a fairy tale and a military campaign. Chinese lanterns hung from ancient oak trees, a string quartet played Mozart beneath a white silk pavilion, and London's finest paraded across manicured lawns in their most elaborate afternoon attire. Elena stood near the rose arbour in a gown of deep violet that Mrs. Evans had insisted brought out the warmth in her eyes, watching Camille hold court near the fountain. Her sister wore palest green today, like sea foam, and was surrounded by an admiring circle of gentlemen who seemed perfectly content to worship at the altar of her beauty without requiring actual conversation. Lady Bradley had been vibrating with barely contained anxiety since they'd arrived. The Duke's unprecedented attentions to Elena had become the subject of intense speculation, but surely, at a public event such as this, propriety would reassert itself. The Duke would dance with Camille. The natural order would be restored. The murmur that announced Nathaniel's arrival rippled through the garden like wind through wheat. Eleanor's heart began its now familiar acceleration as she caught sight of him near the terrace. Devastatingly handsome in a blue coat that matched his eyes and made the afternoon sky look pale by comparison. Lord Ashford himself was making the introductions, steering Nathaniel toward the fountain where Camille waited with practiced grace. Elena watched her sister's face illuminate with hope and determination. This was her arena, her natural habitat. Surely here in public, the Duke would acknowledge what everyone could plainly see, that Camille Havisham was the most beautiful woman present, and therefore the most deserving of his attention. Eleanor prepared herself to fade into the roses, to become part of the garden furniture as she'd done at 100 such events before. But Nathaniel's eyes were already searching the crowd, passing over Camille as though she were merely another decorative element, scanning with focused intent until they found Elena half hidden among the blooms. The smile that crossed his face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He excused himself from Lord Ashford with polite brevity and crossed the lawn with such deliberate purpose that conversation began to falter around him. Ladies paused mid-sentence. Gentlemen turned to watch. Even the quartet seemed to play more softly, as though unwilling to miss whatever was about to unfold. "Miss Bradley," he said, reaching her side and bowing with a warmth that was entirely improper and utterly unmistakable. "What a relief to find you. I was afraid you might be trapped in that crowd near the fountain." "Your Grace," Eleanor's voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I find crowds generally overwhelming. The roses are better company." "They are indeed." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse flutter. "Though I wonder if I might persuade you to abandon them temporarily. I have a matter of some importance I need to discuss, and I find I cannot trust anyone's judgment but yours." Behind him, Eleanor could see her mother's face cycling through confusion, hope, and dawning horror. Camille had gone very still, her perfect smile frozen in place. "I would be honored to help if I can, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he corrected quietly, offering his arm. "And perhaps we might walk. Lord Ashford's grounds are extensive, and I believe there are some secluded paths through the woodland garden that would allow for private conversation." The request was outrageous by any standard of propriety. A duke did not abandon the central gathering to walk alone with an unmarried woman through secluded gardens. He certainly did not do so while ignoring the acknowledged beauty of the event. But Elena placed her hand on his arm anyway, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fine fabric of his coat, and allowed him to lead her away from the manicured lawns toward the wilder paths beyond. The woodland garden was a masterpiece of calculated naturalness, carefully tended to appear untended, with winding paths beneath a canopy of beech and oak, and small clearings where wildflowers grew in artful profusion. The sounds of the party faded behind them, replaced by birdsong and the whisper of leaves. They walked in silence for several minutes, and Elena became acutely aware of the precise point where her hand rested on his arm. The matching rhythm of their steps, the careful distance he maintained even as he guided her deeper into the green shadows. "I need to make a decision," Nathaniel said finally, his voice low and serious. "One that will affect the rest of my life, and quite possibly yours as well." Elena's breath caught. "Your Grace, Nathaniel, I'm not certain I understand." He stopped walking, turning to face her in a small clearing where afternoon light filtered through the leaves in golden coins. "I think you do. I think you've understood since the first moment we spoke, just as I have." "Please," Elena whispered, her composure beginning to fracture. "Please, don't speak in riddles. I cannot bear to misunderstand you." Nathaniel reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and took her hand in both of his. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm, the first time he had touched her with genuine intent, without the excuse of propriety or assistance. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "Not today. That would be precipitous and unfair to you. But soon, very soon. And before I do, I need you to tell me honestly whether such a proposal would be welcome, or whether I am deceiving myself about what has been growing between us these past weeks." Elena stared at him, at their joined hands, at the absolute sincerity in his face. Every rational thought in her head was screaming that this was impossible, that dukes did not marry penniless second daughters, that men like him did not choose women like her when women like Camille existed. But his hands were warm around hers, and the hope in his eyes was painfully real. "I don't understand," she managed. "Why me? I have no fortune, no connections, no great beauty. Camille is a lovely ornament," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "And I have no need of ornaments. I need a partner, Eleanor. Someone who sees the work that must be done and helps me do it. Someone who speaks truth instead of flattery. Someone whose quiet strength makes me want to be worthy of it." He raised her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "You once asked me not to misunderstand my intentions," he said softly. "So let me be perfectly clear. I am courting you, Eleanor Bradley. Only you. I have been since the moment you told me the factory bill was well-intentioned performance, and if you will permit it, I intend to make you my Duchess." The world seemed to tilt and resettle around her. Somewhere in the distance, the garden party continued, oblivious. Camille was probably still standing by the fountain in her seafoam gown. Lady Bradley was probably faint with confusion, but here, in this quiet clearing with his hands warm around hers, Elena finally allowed herself to believe in the impossible. "It would be welcome," she whispered. "So welcome, Nathaniel." His smile was radiant, transforming his usually reserved features into something almost boyish with joy. He turned her hand over gently, cradling it in his palm, and traced his thumb across the delicate skin of her wrist, a touch so intimate it made her shiver. "Then, I will make it official very soon," he promised. "But first, there is something you need to know, something that may change your answer." The rumors began as whispers, subtle as smoke, and twice as insidious. Eleanor first noticed them 3 days after the garden party. In the studied way, Lady Pemberton's eyes slid away from hers during a musicale. In the sudden silence that fell when she entered the retiring room at the theatre. Something had shifted in the social atmosphere, turning what had been bemused speculation about the Duke's attentions into something darker and more pointed. "Have you heard?" she overheard one matron murmur to another behind a fan. "They say the first Duchess died under quite mysterious circumstances. A fall, supposedly, but there were questions." "Hush. And now he's pushing that dreadful bill through Parliament. My husband says it's political suicide, interfering with property rights that way. Perhaps that's why he needs a wife who won't ask inconvenient questions." The word slithered through Eleanor's composure like ice water. First Duchess. She had known, of course, that Nathaniel had been married before. It was mentioned in passing in the society pages. But no one had ever discussed the details, and Nathaniel himself had never spoken of her. Lady Bradley had noticed the change as well, her anxiety sharpening into something approaching panic. "I don't understand what's happening," she fretted, pacing the drawing room while Camille watched with an expression somewhere between vindication and genuine concern. "The Duke's attentions seem so decided. But now there are these dreadful whispers. Elena, what did you do?" "Nothing, Mamma," Elena replied quietly, though her hands trembled as she sorted through the morning's correspondence. "I've done nothing at all." But doubt had begun its corrosive work. What if she had misunderstood? What if Nathaniel's attentions were not about genuine affection, but about finding someone safe, manageable, unlikely to cause complications? The answer arrived in the form of Lady Fenella Thorne. Eleanor encountered her at the Countess of Marlborough's afternoon salon, a gathering of supposed intellectual discourse that was actually a battlefield in silk and superficial wit. Lady Fenella was a striking woman in her early 30s, dressed in rich burgundy that spoke of both wealth and impeccable taste. Her beauty was sharp-edged and knowing, the kind that came from understanding exactly how to wield power in drawing rooms and ballrooms alike. Elena had seen her before, always at the periphery of the Duke's circle, watching with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. "Miss Bradley," Lady Fenella said, materializing at Elena's elbow with the practiced grace of an ambush. "How fortuitous to find you alone. I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately." Eleanor's instincts prickled with warning. "Lady Fenella, I'm afraid I was just—" "Oh, this will only take a moment." Fenella's smile was gracious and utterly devoid of warmth. "I wanted to offer you some advice. Woman to woman, you understand? I'm not certain. You must be feeling quite overwhelmed by the Duke's attentions. Fenella continued smoothly, steering Elena toward a quieter corner of the salon with subtle but inexorable pressure. It's all happened so quickly, hasn't it? One moment you're the overlooked sister, the next you're being courted by one of England's most powerful men. It must feel like a fairy tale. There was something poisonous beneath the sympathetic words. Elena straightened her spine, calling on every ounce of dignity she possessed. The Duke and I share certain intellectual interests. I don't believe that's cause for concern. Intellectual interests. Fenella's laugh was like cut glass. My dear, how refreshingly naive you are. Tell me, has the Duke mentioned his first wife to you? The late Duchess Arabella? The name landed like a blow. Elena had never heard it spoken aloud. He has not discussed his late wife with me, no. It would hardly be appropriate. No, I suppose he wouldn't. Fenella's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Poor Arabella. So beautiful, so spirited, so utterly unsuited to the role of political wife. She had opinions, you see, strong ones. And she wasn't afraid to voice them, even when they contradicted the Duke's carefully laid plans. There was quite a scandal before she died. She publicly opposed one of his parliamentary initiatives. The embarrassment was considerable. Elena's throat had gone tight. I fail to see what this has to do with me. Don't you? Fenella tilted her head, her expression shifting into something almost pitying. My dear Miss Bradley, you seem like a genuinely kind young woman, so I feel compelled to warn you. The Duke is currently championing a very controversial bill, one that would restructure tenant rights and limit the power of landowners. Half of Parliament despises him for it. His political enemies are circling like wolves. I'm aware of his work, Eleanor said carefully. I admire his commitment to reform. I'm sure you do. But you must understand, what the Duke needs right now isn't a partner, it's a shield. Fenella's voice dropped to an intimate whisper, deadly in its quiet certainty. He needs a wife who won't cause complications, someone meek and pliable, who will smile prettily at political dinners and never contradict him in public. Someone so grateful for his attention that she'll never question his motives or his methods. Someone, in short, who is the exact opposite of his first wife. The words struck with surgical precision, finding every insecurity Elena had ever harbored about herself. You're saying... I'm saying that the Duke is a brilliant strategist, Miss Bradley, and you are exactly the kind of woman who would serve his current purposes perfectly. No scandalous beauty to attract attention. No powerful family with their own political agenda. No history of independent thought that might prove inconvenient. Fenella's smile turned razor-sharp. You're a convenient choice for a man who needs a docile wife to rehabilitate his image. Nothing more. Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Every moment of the past weeks suddenly looked different through this new, poisonous lens. Nathaniel's interest in her charity work, was that genuine admiration, or merely vetting her for political usefulness? His praise of her quiet depth, was that love, or was he simply confirming that she would be sufficiently manageable? I don't believe you, Elena whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Don't you? Fenella's eyes were pitiless. Then ask yourself this. Why would a duke, a man who could have anyone, choose the overlooked sister with no dowry, no connections, and no remarkable beauty? What possible reason could he have unless you serve some very specific purpose? She leaned closer, her perfume cloying and overwhelming. You're being used, Miss Bradley. And the truly sad part is that you're so desperate to believe someone could love you for yourself that you'll let it happen. With that, Lady Fenella swept away, leaving Elena standing alone near the wall, her composure shattered and her hands trembling. Around her, the salon continued its glittering performance, but Elena heard none of it. In her mind, she was replaying every conversation with Nathaniel, examining every touch, every smile, every declaration through this new, horrifying possibility. He had said he needed a partner, not an ornament. But what if what he really needed was someone too grateful and too insignificant to ever become a liability? What if Lady Fenella was right? That evening, when Nathaniel's card arrived requesting to call the following afternoon, Eleanor stared at it with tears burning in her eyes. For the first time since their acquaintance began, she found herself dreading his arrival rather than counting the hours until it. Because now she would have to look into his eyes and ask the question that Lady Fenella had planted like poison in her heart. Do you love me? Or do you simply need me to be silent? The Duchess of Somerset's ball was even more magnificent than the first, with thousands of candles turning the ballroom into a constellation of light and shadow. Elena stood near the terrace doors in a gown of midnight purple silk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She had barely slept since Lady Fenella's poisonous words. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that pitying voice, meek and pliable, a convenient shield, so desperate to believe someone could love you. Nathaniel had arrived precisely at 9, as promised, his blue coat immaculate, his eyes searching the crowd with focused intent until they found her. The warmth that had flooded his expression made her chest ache. Because what if it was all performance? What if she was simply the latest move in a political strategy she was too naive to understand? He crossed to her side, with the same deliberate purpose that had characterized all his movements since they met. Oblivious to the whispers that followed him, the curious and calculating stares. "Elena," he said quietly, and the intimacy of her name in his voice nearly broke her. "You look troubled. What's wrong?" She couldn't answer, couldn't force words past the tightness in her throat. His brow furrowed with concern. "Come with me, please. We need to speak privately." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, allowing him to guide her away from the glittering crowd, through the terrace doors and into the torch-lit garden beyond. He led her past the main paths where other couples strolled, deeper into the shadows until they reached a secluded corner near an old stone fountain, where the music from the ballroom was muted and the night wrapped around them like velvet. "Now," Nathaniel said, turning to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Tell me what's happened. You've been different since you received my card yesterday. Distant. Have I done something to offend you?" The genuine worry in his voice nearly undid her. Elena pulled away from his touch, needing distance to find courage. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts at control. "And I need you to tell me the truth, Nathaniel. Not the polite truth, not the diplomatic truth, the real truth." His expression shifted, becoming watchful and serious. "Always. You know that." "Do I?" The words emerged sharper than she'd intended, edged with weeks of accumulated doubt. "Lady Fenella Thorne spoke to me 3 days ago. She told me things about your first wife, about the political scandal, about the bill you're pushing through Parliament." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, waiting. "She said—" Eleanor's voice broke, and she forced herself to continue. "She said that you're not looking for a partner, that you're looking for a shield, someone meek and pliable, who will be silent and obedient, who won't cause the kind of complications your first wife did. Someone so grateful for your attention that she'll never question you, never contradict you, never become a political liability." The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between them. "She said," Elena whispered, "that I'm a convenient choice, a strategic one, that no duke would choose the overlooked sister with no beauty, no fortune, and no connections unless she served a very specific purpose." "And you believed her?" Nathaniel's voice was low and carefully controlled, but something dangerous flickered beneath the calm. "I don't know what to believe," the confession tore out of her. Everything she said made terrible sense. Why would you choose me, Nathaniel? What possible reason could you have unless I'm using you? He finished the thought with devastating precision. Unless every conversation, every shared moment, every declaration of genuine feeling has been calculated manipulation to secure a politically advantageous marriage to a woman too insignificant to cause me trouble. Yes. The admission felt like defeat. Nathaniel stood very still for a long moment, his face unreadable in the shadows. Then he moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could see the storm building in his grey eyes. "You want the truth? Here it is." His voice had gone rough with suppressed emotion. "My first wife, Arabella, was beautiful and spirited and utterly miserable as a duchess. She didn't want a partner, she wanted an audience for her drama. Every political position I took, she opposed publicly. Every reform I championed, she sabotaged at dinner parties. Not because she disagreed on principle, but because she enjoyed the attention it brought her." He took a breath, and Elena saw genuine pain cross his features. "When she died, I grieved, not for the wife I'd lost, but for the partnership I'd never had. And I swore I would never marry again, unless I found someone real. Someone who understood that being a duchess isn't about being ornamental or obedient. It's about being essential. Nathaniel, let me finish." He caught her hand, his grip almost desperate. "Yes, I'm pushing a controversial bill. Yes, my political enemies are circling. And yes, Lady Fenella is one of them. She's been angling for a position as my duchess for 2 years, and she's furious that I've shown you the attention she thinks she deserves." His thumb traced across her knuckles, the touch achingly familiar. "But Elena, if I wanted a meek, silent wife to serve as a political shield, I could have chosen from a dozen candidates who would have been far more strategically useful than you. Women with powerful fathers, influential families, political connections. Then why? Because none of them see me." The words burst from him with raw intensity. "They see the Duke of Danbury. They see the title, the fortune, the power. They want to be a duchess, not my partner. They flatter and perform and tell me what they think I want to hear." He stepped closer, his free hand rising to cup her face with exquisite gentleness. "But you, Eleanor, from the very first moment you spoke to me as though I were simply Nathaniel, a man who needed honest counsel, genuine partnership, real conversation. You challenged my assumptions. You improved my proposals. You made me laugh, made me think, made me feel like something more than a political asset to be managed." "I'm still nobody," Eleanor whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No beauty, no fortune. You're everything." His voice broke on the word. "You're brilliant and compassionate and real in a world of performance. Your quiet strength is worth more than 1,000 strategic marriages. I don't need a shield, Eleanor. I need you. Only you." "Nathaniel." He pulled her closer, his hands framing her face, his grey eyes blazing with an emotion that could not be feigned. "I love you, not because you're convenient or meek or safe, but because you see the man beneath the title and love him anyway. Because your mind challenges me and your spirit steadies me, and the thought of facing the rest of my life without you is unbearable." "I love you too," Elena breathed, the admission breaking free like sunlight through clouds. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then let me prove it," Nathaniel whispered, and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste brushing of lips that propriety might have allowed. It was fierce and tender and desperate, his arms pulling her against him as though he could anchor her to him through sheer will. Eleanor's hands fisted in his coat, her world narrowing to the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his embrace, the overwhelming rightness of being held by him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Nathaniel pressed his forehead to hers. "Tomorrow," he said roughly, "I'm going to formally ask for your hand, and I don't care who objects or what rumors Fenella spreads. You are mine, Elena Bradley, and I am yours, forever." The scandal sheet arrived with the Morning Post, and Lady Bradley's shriek of horror echoed through the entire household. Eleanor found her mother in the breakfast room, the offending paper clutched in trembling hands, her face drained of all colour. Camille stood by the window in her dressing gown, looking genuinely frightened for the first time in Elena's memory. "What is it?" Elena asked, though dread had already settled like lead in her stomach. Lady Bradley couldn't speak, merely thrust the paper toward her with shaking fingers. The article was positioned prominently on the second page, anonymous, but clearly written by someone with intimate knowledge of society's workings. The headline alone made Eleanor's blood run cold. "A Duke's strategic romance, political expediency disguised as courtship?" Her eyes skimmed the poisonous paragraphs. One cannot help but observe the curious timing of the Duke of Danbury's sudden courtship of Miss E.B., the notably unassuming sister of a family known more for its financial difficulties than its social prominence. His Grace, currently championing a controversial tenant reform bill that has alienated half of Parliament, appears to have selected a bride whose very insignificance serves as convenient camouflage for his political maneuvering. Unlike his late wife, the spirited and opinionated Duchess Arabella, whose public contradictions of her husband's policies caused considerable embarrassment, Miss B brings neither beauty, fortune, nor influential connections to the match. What she offers instead is far more valuable to a duke in politically troubled waters. A grateful silence and a meek compliance that will never threaten to overshadow his ambitions. One must ask, is this love, or merely the calculated selection of a wife who knows her place? The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Every insecurity Eleanor possessed, every doubt Lady Fenella had planted, now published for all of London to read and dissect over morning chocolate. "We're ruined," Lady Bradley moaned, sinking into a chair. "Absolutely ruined. The Duke will withdraw his attentions immediately. No man of his stature would proceed with a courtship after such public humiliation. And who will have you now, Eleanor? Who will have either of you, once it's known that a duke found you so unsuitable that he—" "Mama, stop." Camille's voice was surprisingly firm. She crossed to Elena, her expression complex, part sympathy, part something that looked almost like respect. "We don't know what the Duke will do, but Elena knew what he should do. The strategic choice, the politically sensible choice, would be to distance himself from her immediately, to dismiss the entire courtship as an exaggerated friendship that society had misconstrued, to protect his reputation and his bill by cutting her loose. She wouldn't blame him. This was exactly what Lady Fenella had warned would happen if she became a liability. The knock at the door came at 11 o'clock, precise and authoritative. Lady Bradley leapt to her feet, her hands fluttering in panic. "It's him! Oh God, it's him! Eleanor, go upstairs, quickly. We'll tell him you're indisposed, that you're mortified by the scandal, that—" "No." Eleanor's voice emerged steadier than she felt. "If the Duke has come to end this, he deserves to do so with honesty. I won't hide." The butler appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, the Duke of Danbury requests an audience with Miss Eleanor Bradley and her family." Nathaniel entered before anyone could respond, and the sight of him made Elena's breath catch. He wore his most formal attire, the blue coat that matched his eyes, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, every inch the powerful Duke. But his face was set in lines of such controlled fury that the air itself seemed to crackle around him. In his hand, he carried a copy of the scandal sheet. "Your Grace," Lady Bradley began, her voice thin with terror, "I must apologize for this dreadful business. If we had known that that is to say, we never intended—" "Lady Bradley." Nathaniel's voice cut through her stammering with the precision of a blade. "I did not come here to discuss scandal sheets or the poisonous individuals who write them. I came here to formally request your daughter's hand in marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. He met her eyes across the room, and the fierce determination she saw there nearly brought her to her knees. "You cannot be serious," Lady Bradley whispered. "After that article, after what it implies, surely you must see that proceeding now would only demonstrate that I do not make my decisions based on anonymous slander," Nathaniel interrupted, his gaze never leaving Elena's. "Lady Bradley, Lord Bradley is, I believe, in his study. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with him formally regarding my intentions toward your daughter." Lady Bradley looked between Nathaniel and Elena, her expression cycling through shock, calculation, and desperate hope. Yes, of course. I'll fetch him immediately." She fled the room, leaving Camille hovering uncertainly near the window. Nathaniel finally tore his gaze from Elena long enough to address her sister. "Miss Havisham, might I have a moment alone with your sister?" Camille looked at Eleanor, something soft and almost wistful crossing her beautiful features. "Of course, Your Grace." She paused at the door, glancing back. "Eleanor, I hope you know how lucky he is." Then she was gone, and Eleanor was alone with the man who had somehow, impossibly, chosen her despite everything. "You shouldn't have come," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "That article. Nathaniel, it will damage you politically. Lady Fenella has made me a liability, exactly as she intended. If you marry me now, after this, your enemies will say, 'I don't care what they say.'" He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands framing her face with exquisite gentleness that contradicted the steel in his voice. "Let them think what they like. Let them whisper and speculate and write their poisonous articles. I will not let slander dim the brightest truth of my life. But your bill will pass or fail on its own merits, not on whom I choose to marry. And Eleanor—" His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Even if marrying you cost me every political ally I possess, I would still choose you, every time, without hesitation." "Why?" she whispered. "Because you are worth more than all of it. The titles, the power, the political maneuvering, none of it means anything without someone real to share it with. Without you." His voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "I need you, Elena. Not as a political strategy or a convenient shield, but as my partner, my equal, my love. Stand with me. Face them all with me. Be my Duchess, and show London exactly what true strength looks like." Eleanor looked into his grey eyes and saw her entire future there. Not a future of silence and meek compliance, but one of genuine partnership, and shared purpose, of challenges met together and battles fought side by side. "Yes," she said, the word emerging clear and strong. "Yes, Nathaniel. I'll marry you. I'll stand with you. I'll face them all." The smile that broke across his face was like dawn breaking after the longest night. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were infinitely precious, and Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be chosen, not for what she could provide or how little trouble she would cause, but for exactly who she was. When Lord Bradley arrived, summoned from his study in a state of bewildered confusion, he found the Duke of Danbury holding his daughter's hand with unmistakable possession, both of them wearing expressions of such fierce determination that the outcome was never in doubt. "Lord Bradley," Nathaniel said formally, "I am here to request the honor of your daughter Eleanor's hand in marriage, and I assure you, no scandal sheet, no social pressure, and no political consideration will alter my conviction that she is the only woman I could ever wish to make my Duchess." Outside, London might be whispering. Lady Fenella might be savouring her temporary victory. The scandal sheets might be preparing their next salvo. But here, in the Bradley drawing room, with Nathaniel's hand warm and steady in hers, Eleanor finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the Duke's private chapel at Danbury Castle, a deliberate choice that bypassed London's gossip mills while making an unmistakable statement. Nathaniel would marry Eleanor on his own terms, in his own time, and society's opinion was irrelevant. The night before the ceremony, Eleanor sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by half-packed trunks and the scattered remnants of her former life. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Danbury, a transformation so profound it still seemed impossible when she allowed herself to think about it too directly. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Eleanor, may I come in?" Camille stood in the doorway, still beautiful, in a dressing gown of pale silk, but softer somehow, less armoured than Elena had ever seen her. "Of course," Eleanor gestured to the bed, and Camille settled beside her with the unconscious grace that had always come so naturally. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Camille said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Elena blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For resenting you. For being angry that the Duke chose you instead of me." Camille's smile was rueful and achingly honest. "I was furious, you know. After that first ball, when he walked past me like I was furniture and sought you out instead, I couldn't understand it. I thought there must be some mistake, some trick." "Camille, let me finish." Camille took Elena's hand, her grip warm and sisterly in a way it hadn't been since childhood. "I've spent my entire life being told that my beauty was my value, that if I was lovely enough, accomplished enough, perfect enough, I could secure a brilliant marriage and save our family, and I believed it. I made myself into exactly what I thought men wanted." Her voice caught slightly. "But the Duke didn't want that. He didn't want the performance. And watching him with you these past weeks, I finally understood what I've been missing. All the admirers I've collected, all the compliments I've received, none of them ever saw me, Elena. They saw a beautiful object to possess, not a person to know." Elena squeezed her sister's hand, tears prickling her eyes. "You deserve more than that." "I'm beginning to think so." Camille's smile turned genuine, if bittersweet. "You and the Duke, the way he looks at you, the way you talk together like the rest of the world disappears. I envy that more than I can say. Not because he's a duke, but because you found someone who sees your soul and loves it." "You'll find that too," Eleanor said fiercely. "Someone who sees past the beauty to everything else you are." "Perhaps." Camille leaned over and kissed Eleanor's cheek, a gesture of pure sisterly affection. "But tonight isn't about me. Tonight is about telling you that I'm proud of you, Eleanor. You were always the brave one, the genuine one. I'm just glad the Duke was wise enough to recognize it." After Camille left, Eleanor sat in the quiet, her heart full of a bittersweet joy. For the first time in their lives, she and her sister had seen each other clearly, without the distorting lens of comparison and competition. The next morning, Lady Bradley appeared in Elena's dressing room as Mrs. Evans arranged the final touches of her wedding ensemble. The gown was a masterpiece of understated elegance, deep violet silk that seemed to capture light and shadow, with delicate silver embroidery that caught the morning sun. "Leave us," Lady Bradley said quietly to the maid, and Mrs. Evans curtsied and slipped away. Elena turned to face her mother, bracing herself for last-minute instructions or criticisms. But Lady Bradley simply stood there, her expression unreadable, studying her daughter, as though seeing her for the first time. "You look beautiful," she said finally. "Not like Camille. You could never look like Camille, but beautiful in your own way. Dignified, Duchess-like. Thank you, Mama." Lady Bradley moved closer, her hands reaching out to adjust Elena's veil with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I owe you an apology, Elena. I spent so many years focused on Camille, on her prospects, her beauty, her future. I told myself it was practical, that she was our best chance for security. But the truth is, I failed to see your strengths, because they weren't the strengths I understood." Elena's throat tightened. "Mama, you have a quiet strength that I mistook for weakness, a depth of character I dismissed as lack of sparkle, and somehow, despite my neglect, you became exactly the kind of woman a duke would be wise to choose." Lady Bradley's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The Duke of Danbury sees what I was too blind to recognize. You are remarkable, Elena, and I am so very proud to be your mother." The words Elena had waited 21 years to hear finally arrived, and they were sweeter than she'd ever imagined. "I love you, Mama," she whispered, and allowed herself to be pulled into her mother's embrace. The ceremony itself was intimate and profound, witnessed by only close family and a few trusted friends. When Nathaniel took her hand and spoke his vows, his grey eyes holding hers with unwavering devotion, Eleanor felt the final pieces of her old self fall away. She was no longer the overlooked sister, the convenient choice, the one who lived in shadows. She was Eleanor Crowhurst, Duchess of Danbury, partner to a man who had chosen her not despite who she was, but because of it. They emerged from the chapel into brilliant afternoon sunshine to find a crowd had gathered despite the private nature of the ceremony, society matrons and curious onlookers, some genuinely well-wishing, others clearly hoping for drama. Lady Fenella Thorne stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression a masterwork of controlled fury beneath a brittle smile. Nathaniel saw her too. His hand tightened on Elena's, and then, with deliberate intention, he turned to his new wife in full view of everyone assembled and kissed her. Not a chaste brush of lips, but a thorough, possessive kiss that declared his choice unmistakably and irrevocably. When they broke apart, Eleanor was breathless and blushing, and Nathaniel was smiling with unrestrained joy. "Let them talk," he murmured against her ear. "Let them whisper and speculate and disapprove. You are mine, and I am yours, and that is the only truth that matters." The carriage that would carry them to Dover and then to the continent was waiting, decorated with white ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Nathaniel handed Elena inside with exquisite care, then followed, settling beside her and immediately taking her hand. As the carriage rolled forward, Elena caught a final glimpse of her family. Camille waving with genuine warmth, Lady Bradley dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, even her father looking pleased and proud. Then the crowd was behind them, and ahead lay only the future, bright, uncertain, and infinitely promising. "Happy, Duchess?" Nathaniel asked, bringing her hand to his lips. Elena leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute rightness of this moment. Behind them, London whispered and judged. Ahead, the world waited to be explored and reformed together. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she said. "Your Grace." His laugh was warm and free. "Nathaniel," he corrected, just as he always did. "Nathaniel," she agreed, and kissed him as the carriage carried them toward their new life, leaving scandal and doubt and shadows behind forever. The honeymoon was nothing like Elena had imagined. They travelled through the Lake District and into Scotland, staying at quiet inns and remote estates where Nathaniel was known, but not performing the role of Duke. In the evenings, they dined privately and spread maps and documents across their table, discussing tenant rights and parliamentary strategy with the same passion other newlyweds might reserve for poetry and romance. Though there was romance, too, in the way Nathaniel's hand found hers during carriage rides, in the reverent way he undressed her each night, in the fierce tenderness of his embrace. But it was the conversations Elena treasured most, the moment she realized he genuinely wanted her opinion not as indulgence, but as necessity. "The opposition is arguing that mandating school hours will reduce agricultural productivity," Nathaniel said one evening in their rooms overlooking Windermere, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his formal demeanor abandoned in the privacy of their shared space. "Lord Pemberton specifically claims tenant families will suffer economically if children can't work full days during harvest." Eleanor studied the draft bill he'd shown her, her mind already working through the practical implications. A month ago, she would have hesitated to voice her thoughts, afraid of seeming presumptuous. But Nathaniel had spent 3 weeks actively soliciting her perspective, challenging her to think strategically, trusting her insights as he would a valued advisor. She was done diminishing herself. "Then offer them an economic incentive, rather than just a mandate," she said, setting down the document and meeting his eyes with new confidence. "What if the estate provides a small stipend to families whose children attend school regularly, enough to offset the lost labor but not so much that it becomes the primary motivation? Frame it as investment in future productivity rather than sacrifice of current income." Nathaniel stared at her, his expression shifting from consideration to something like awe. "That's brilliant. It transforms the entire argument from punishment to opportunity. Why didn't I think of that?" "Because you're focused on the moral imperative, which is admirable but not always persuasive to men like Pemberton," Elena replied, allowing herself a small smile. "Sometimes you need to speak their language, profit and productivity, to achieve your goals." He crossed to her, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "Have I mentioned recently that marrying you was the smartest decision I've ever made?" "Not in the last 3 hours," she said, laughing as he kissed her thoroughly. But beyond the teasing, Elena felt something profound shifting within herself. The woman who had hidden in shadows at balls, who had believed herself fundamentally less than her beautiful sister, was becoming someone new, someone who understood her own value and wasn't afraid to claim it. When they finally arrived at Danbury Castle 6 weeks after their wedding, Elena's breath caught at her first sight of the ancestral estate. It sprawled across the landscape like something from a medieval tapestry. Grey stone towers, vast wings added over centuries, formal gardens that gave way to parkland and tenant farms, stretching to the horizon. "It's overwhelming." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly, misreading her silence. "But you don't have to transform everything overnight. Take your time. Find your footing." "I need to see the estate books," Eleanor interrupted, her mind already racing ahead. "And I want to visit the tenant farms tomorrow. The ones near the proposed school site specifically. If we're going to implement the stipend program, I need to understand the current accounting structure and how families are managing their expenses." Nathaniel's smile was radiant. "As you wish, Duchess." The estate manager, Mr. Hartwell, was a man of perhaps 50 who had clearly expected the new Duchess to concern herself with redecorating and menu planning. His expression when Eleanor requested a complete review of tenant accounting, school attendance records, and agricultural productivity reports was a masterpiece of barely concealed shock. "Your Grace, these are rather complex financial matters. Perhaps the Duke would prefer to—" "The Duke," Nathaniel interrupted smoothly, "would prefer his wife to have complete access to any documents she requests. The Duchess will be overseeing the educational and tenant welfare initiatives directly." Elena spent the next 3 weeks immersed in the practical realities of the estate. She rose early to visit tenant farms before the day's heat, talking to mothers about their children's schedules and learning needs. She sat in the estate office until late evening, cross-referencing accounting ledgers and identifying inefficiencies in the current system. What she discovered was both troubling and opportunity-rich. The estate's accounting was antiquated, making it nearly impossible for tenants to understand their actual expenses versus income. Children were kept from potential schooling not just for labor, but because families genuinely couldn't calculate whether they could afford the lost work hours. Eleanor designed a new system, simplified ledgers that tenant families could understand and maintain themselves, coupled with quarterly reviews that would help them plan for seasonal variations. She restructured the proposed school schedule to work around peak agricultural periods rather than against them, and she personally interviewed potential teachers, seeking women who understood rural life rather than just possessed credentials. The tenant school opened 4 months after her arrival at Danbury, housed in a building Elena had helped design, practical, well-lit, positioned precisely between the 2 largest tenant clusters. On opening day, 23 children attended, their families cautiously hopeful about this experiment in education. Within a year, attendance had doubled, and Lord Pemberton himself had written to Nathaniel requesting details about the stipend program, having observed improved productivity on the Danbury estate despite reduced child labor. The social columns that had once questioned Elena's suitability as Duchess now wrote admiringly of her reforms. "The Duchess of Danbury," one article noted, "has proven that true nobility lies not in appearance but in action. Her innovative approaches to estate management and tenant welfare have set a new standard for aristocratic responsibility." Lady Fenella Thorne, Elena heard through society correspondence, had withdrawn to her country estate, her influence in London diminished by the spectacular failure of her campaign against the Duke's marriage. One evening, nearly 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor sat in the Danbury Library reviewing reports from the estate schools with Nathaniel beside her, their chairs pulled close together, his hand resting casually on her shoulder as he read over her notes. "We should expand the program," Elena said thoughtfully. "These literacy rates, Nathaniel, the children are learning faster than we projected. With proper funding, we could add advanced mathematics and basic engineering principles by next year." "Write a proposal," he said immediately. "I'll present it to the House of Lords next session. If anyone questions the feasibility, I'll simply invite them to visit Danbury and see what you've accomplished." Eleanor set aside her papers and turned to face her husband fully. He was watching her with that expression she'd come to treasure, the one that said he saw not a duchess performing duties, but a partner engaged in shared purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me instead of someone who would have brought you political alliances or social advantage?" Nathaniel pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her with possessive tenderness. I chose the only woman who could be my true partner. Someone who doesn't just support my work, but improves it. Who sees problems I miss and solutions I'd never imagine. Who transformed herself from the overlooked sister into the most formidable Duchess in England. I'm not formidable, Eleanor protested, though she was smiling. You terrify half the estate managers in the county with your accounting reforms, Nathaniel said, laughing. You've revolutionized tenant education. You've made our estate the most efficiently managed property in 3 counties. And you did it all quietly, without fanfare or self-promotion, until everyone looked around and realized you'd changed everything. He kissed her softly, thoroughly. That's true power, Elena. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that transforms the world while everyone else is still deciding whether to take you seriously. Elena leaned against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and thought about the girl she'd been, hiding in shadows, believing herself fundamentally insufficient, resigned to invisibility. That girl was gone. Transformed not by marriage or title, but by being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. Through the library windows she could see the lights of the tenant village, where children who would have remained illiterate were learning to read and calculate and dream of futures their parents had never imagined possible. I love you, she whispered. My brilliant, reforming, impossible Duke. And I love you, Nathaniel replied. My quiet, powerful, absolutely perfect Duchess. Outside, the world had finally learned what Nathaniel had recognized from the first moment, that the overlooked sister in purple had always been extraordinary. She had simply been waiting for someone wise enough to see it. And now, as the Duchess of Danbury, she would spend the rest of her life proving that true nobility came not from beauty or birth, but from strength of character and depth of purpose, qualities she had possessed all along the end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.